A young girl is studying at university. She was forced to write a report about the paintings of famous artists who played an important role in the world of fine arts. Unfortunately, the protagonist was not strong in art, and she always had problems with it. It turns out that even as a child, the girl tried to start a career as an artist, but she had no talent. In order to get a scholarship at the university, the protagonist needs to qualitatively pass the exam. Therefore, the girl went to the gallery of her city. Suddenly, the protagonist stumbles upon an interesting painting. She doesn't understand what it depicts and reads the description. It turns out that, according to legend, this very painting is able to fulfill any human desire. The young girl does not take it seriously, but still decides to make her cherished wish. The main character asks to be reborn and live a completely different life. A few seconds after the girl's words, a mysterious image enveloped the young student. The girl lost consciousness and woke up in an unfamiliar room. When the protagonist decided to look around, she came across a mirror. Suddenly, the girl realized that she was in a different body. At that moment, the girl began to remember the memories of the mistress of this body named Viola Helen. After a while, the protagonist realizes that Viola is a secondary heroine of her favorite novel. According to the plot of the famous book, the girl was a negative character and was killed at the end of the work. When the new Helen settles down, the protagonist resolves to live this life happily. She claims that she will not repeat the fate of Viola from the novel and will be able to find her vocation. Unfortunately, the ability to draw is valued in the world of the novel, and the real Elena is a famous artist who constantly competed with the main character of the novel named Rabina. After a while, Viola realizes that she can't draw professionally and decides to show it to everyone, after which her career should be ruined and the plot of the novel develops differently. At that moment, the protagonist's servant named Jeanette enters the room to remind her that Viola needs to go to an artist's meeting. On her way to the meeting, the protagonist is struck by the beauty of the world around her. Helen arrives at Rabina's house, where several of her fellow artists live. Viola is purposely terrible at drawing a picture, but her friends are greatly surprised by the protagonist's new style. The girls claim that the artist perfectly managed to convey all the creativity of the picture. Helen begins to deny her success, but at this moment, Rabina begins to praise the girl. She proposes Viola to put her work of art on exhibition so that connoisseurs of paintings will adequately appreciate the magnificent work of the protagonist. In the end, Helen makes a decision and agrees with the proposal of the protagonist of the novel. The girl thinks that she will manage to discover a new kind of art and develop her career and at the same moment disrupt the plot of the book. In the course of a shared tea party, Viola learns that Rabina has gotten engaged to Duke Evan. It turns out that this man is the second main character in the novel who was in love with Rabina. In the evening of the same day, the artists say goodbye and decide to go home. At this moment, the main character calls Robin and asks for help. It turns out that the girl is sure that Evan does not love her and asks Viola to seduce a man so that she can manage to break the engagement. Rabina begins to press the pity of the protagonist and eventually Helen agrees to help her friend. A few days later, the protagonist arrives at an exhibition of paintings, which should show the work that the girl painted. There she meets Rabina, and the latter informs her that Duke Evan has also come to see these works of art. Viola decides to act and finds a man who admires the view from the balcony. The girl begins to flirt with the Duke, but he rejects the protagonist. At this point, Helen begins to manipulate Evan and claims to know his family's secret. It turns out that all the men in their family are cursed. Every time the girls touch their bodies, they are left with terrible burns. Only sincere love can deliver them from this torment. Only after the Duke falls in love can his favorite girl live peacefully with the man. Suddenly, the protagonist begins to manipulate the man and offers him a permanent cure from the terrible curse. After much persuasion and the facts provided, Evan agrees to Viola's proposal. After a while, the protagonist and Rabina go outside and discuss what happened. Suddenly, a strange man grabs Viola and starts swearing. It turns out that the boar's name is Theo. This man is a close friend of the real Viola. The protagonist pushes Theo away, and he stumbles and hurts his leg. At this point, Rabina runs up to the man and ignores her friend. Helen decides to tell Duke Evan everything in order to make him jealous of Rabina to Theo. During the conversation, the impudent boor notices the protagonists and decides to attack the girl. At this point, Evan protects Viola and keeps the bad man from hurting the young and fragile girl. The Duke banishes the villain and unexpectedly falls on the protagonist. Viola is perplexed and greatly embarrassed. Evan rises to his feet and abruptly takes the protagonist to a secluded spot. It turns out that the man wanted to treat her abrasion on his hands so that the girl could continue painting. The couple starts a conversation, during which the protagonists develop a liking for each other. The next few days, the protagonist was at home. The girl did not want to see Rabina and the others because she was ashamed of what had happened. Suddenly, when Viola was drawing pictures, Rabina came to visit her. The girls began to discuss the Duke, and in the process of conversation, the girl learns that Evan refused to be engaged to the main character of the novel. Helen fell into bewilderment and realized that she could not break the plot of the original work of this world. At that moment, Rabina tells that she has been invited to the Fine Arts Academy to teach art. The girl also said that Viola had also been invited for an interview with the director of the Academy for Artists. The principal immediately decided to hire the main character as a teacher. A little later, Viola notices Rabina and Theo discussing something. The young girl becomes suspicious of her friend and quickly leaves. On her way to her class, Helen bumps into Duke Ewan. It turns out that the man is the main sponsor of the Art Academy. The Duke begins to tease the protagonist. But at that moment, Theo interrupts the conversation and starts yelling at the girl. The man asks the protagonist to come back, and at that moment, Ewan pushes the boor away and hugs the protagonist. The man claims that the girl has been in a relationship with him since then. A few days later, Viola remembers what happened and is perplexed. It turns out that afterwards, the Duke had a high fever and fainted. Suddenly, the protagonist finds the personal diary of the real Helen. It turns out that Rabina is a hypocrite who manipulated the protagonist in every possible way and made her look like a villain. Unfortunately, no one came to Viola's lessons. All the students signed up with Robin because they thought the main character was a bad person and a bad artist. At this point, the girl comes up with a plan. Ellen asks Duke to help her hold an open class in the center of the main square so that all the students can see the specific style of her paintings. In the end, the protagonist manages to impress the young artists, and soon all the places at her lessons are occupied. The next day, Viola is about to go to the Duke's estate because Evan took the girl's art supplies after the open class. Suddenly, on the way to the carriage that will take her to the estate, the protagonist meets Rabina. Viola wants to talk to the girl and offers to drive her home. Along the way, Rabina again tries to manipulate the protagonist, as it was earlier with the real Helen. But Viola does not give in to the provocations of the young girl and tells about her relationship with Evan. Rabina gets very upset and tries to press pity, but Helen remains adamant. Upon arrival at the Duke's estate, the girl is greeted personally by Evan. The man gives a tour of his estates, and the girl notices that in his estate there are no girls who are the servants of the protagonist. At this moment, Evan admits that Viola is the first girl who got into the man's house. The Duke invites the girl to a tea party, but she refuses. Eventually, the man claims he will send a carriage for the main character the next day so they can spend time together again. The next day, the protagonist meets a handsome guy named Cale Balo. The man wants to see a lecture on fine arts and decides to stay in the class. Also, a few minutes later, Duke arrives. After the class, all the students, including Cale and Evan, give their drawings to the main character. Suddenly, Duke starts behaving strangely, and at that moment the girl realizes that the man is jealous of her for Balo. When the girl is alone, she decides to look at the drawings of the men. It turns out that Evan tried to draw Viola, but he has no talent for drawing, but Kyle managed to draw a delightful portrait of the main character. Suddenly, Helen's servant enters the room and informs her that Rabina has invited a girl to her birthday party. The main character wore a beautiful dress that exposed her shoulders. When she arrived at Robin's estate, the girl met the Duke. It turned out that he had come here to meet Viola. Suddenly, Evan notices the girl's beautiful dress and decides to cover her bare shoulders with his jacket. At that moment, Rabina notices the guests and rushes to meet them. Everyone around them begins to discuss that Ellen has seduced Rabina's favorite man. The protagonist gives an exclusive picture that she drew herself. Suddenly, Rabina again started trying to manipulate the girl, but Viola insisted on her opinion and left the party. Sometime later, in a store for artists, Helen meets Cale, who shows sympathy for the girl and after a while admits that he has fallen in love with the main character's art style. The couple arrives at the art academy and the boys run into Duke. Evan is perplexed to see his beloved with another man. He becomes jealous of the main character, but tries to restrain his emotions. After another class, Viola and Cale leave together. The girl thinks about the fact that she won't be able to cure Duke because in the plot of Robin's novel she has to do it. That is why she decides to stay with Belo. Suddenly, the protagonist slips and falls down. At that moment, Duke Evan saves the girl and she lands on top of him. Viola notices that the man is lying unconscious and starts crying. Helen decides to go after the people who will help the protagonist, but at that moment the girl is stopped by Evan. The man embraces Viola and the couple realizes that the protagonist has managed to cure Duke. After a while, Rabina comes running in and hugs Viola. At this moment, Evan calls the main character to him so that the girl can help him. Rabina decides to offer her help and reaches out to the man. The Duke begins to talk about the fact that he did not allow the girl to touch him and refuses her help. At this point, the protagonist begins to mock the hypocritical girl and leaves with her lover. Eventually, Viola meets Cale again and rejects him. A few days later, out of the blue, the Duke arrives at Helen's estate. It turns out that the main character's mother has invited Evan to visit to get to know him personally. After drinking alcoholic beverages, the main character fell asleep and Viola's parents decided to take the man to the room that is next to Helen's room. In the evening of the same day, the protagonist decides to check on her lover. She bends over his body and admires the man's beauty. At that moment, Evan wakes up and grabs Viola and hugs her tightly, then immediately falls asleep again. The next day, the protagonist discovers that in her office, all the drawings that her students created have been destroyed. After a while, the Duke manages to find the culprit who did it. Turns out it was Rabina's groupie. The girl starts to accuse Viola of having stolen her lover from Robin. At this moment, Elena decides to spread a rumor that Evan is castrated. The girl claims that it was because of this that she decided to help her friend and seduce her inferior man. The protagonist confesses to Evan what she had to do to make the criminal believe her. Surprisingly, the man did not condemn and swear at his beloved. The protagonist is very grateful for this and decides to hug her beloved man tightly. The next day, Viola Rabina receives an invitation to a tea party at the Imperial Palace. It turns out that the prince invited famous female artists to paint a portrait of his wife. The protagonist panicked because he does not know how to draw portraits of people. Duke Evan calms his beloved with the help of beautiful words. At this moment, Helen admires the charisma of her future husband and, suddenly, the man calls the girl a pervert. The next day, the artists arrive at the prince's palace and enter his study. Suddenly, Cale enters the room and the prince claims that the man is his brother. A prince explains to the girls that they are to draw a picture for his wife within a month. The man states that the genre of the painting can be anything. After talking to the emperor's son, Sir Cale started flirting with the protagonist again. At this point, Viola had to reject the persistent prince a second time and go home. The protagonist decides to go to a gallery with paintings of nudes to study them. While walking through the gallery, Viola meets a girl named Saviet Herbert. The girls decide to go to the nearest cafe to drink tea and talk about different topics. After the tea party, the couple plans to meet again and become best friends. The deadline is coming to an end. After completing the picture, the protagonist decides to spend time with the Duke and goes to spend the night with him. After a fun night, Viola is satisfied with Evan and decides to invite her lover to the banquet that the imperial family arranged before the birthday of the prince's wife. During the banquet, Rabina invited the protagonist to her home to help her with the painting. The next day, late at night, Helen arrives at her enemy's estate and sees Rabina painting a picture of a naked girl. Fortunately for the protagonist, the girl drew the most standard picture that many artists have drawn. A few days later, the moment came for the artists to show their work to the prince's family. It turned out that Rabina substituted her painting for the portrait of the prince and his wife. At this point, the princess did not listen to the girl's story and went straight to the evaluation of the main character's painting. It turned out that the girl painted a beautiful forest, which was filled with meaning. At that moment, the princess appreciated Viola's work, but suddenly began to curse at the girl. It turned out that Rabina had drawn a naked girl on purpose to give it to the princess on Helen's behalf. The protagonist was able to refute the incident and prove that the painting in question was created by Rabina. The princess orders the artists to leave the imperial estate and wait for the results after checking the paintings. A few days later, the princess contacts the protagonist and thanks her for the beautiful picture. The young girl apologizes to Viola for misunderstanding her. It turns out that they managed to find out that it was Rabina who drew the picture of a naked girl and sent it on behalf of Helen. As a result, the princess promises to punish the villain fairly. After a while, the princess and Viola become good friends and have fun in the princess's private gallery. Suddenly, Duke finds his beloved and takes her home. On the way, the girl realizes that the man wants to send her to the estate of Helen's family and, suddenly, kisses the protagonist. Eventually, the loving couple set off for the Duke's estate. A few days later, the loving couple meet again and the girl proposes to her favorite man to officially meet her parents. At a meeting with her parents, the couple discusses an engagement date and plan a wedding. After all the important negotiations, the protagonist and the Duke are finally able to live together. Upon arrival at the man's estate, Evan, out of the blue, proposes to the young and beautiful girl he loves.